Good afternoon. This is the fourth in our series of Bible questions. I've been getting a lot of questions in, and I'm trying to collect them together and answer as many as I can within our 10-minute section, but I'm trying to keep to the 10-minute rule. The first thing I'd like to talk about today that some of you have asked about and asked me about on the phone and otherwise is, what is the role of the Sumerians in the New Testament and in the early church? And that's a good question because Jesus uses the example of Samaritans all the time. The Good Samaritan, the woman at the well in Samaria. It's interesting that the book of Acts tells us that one of the greatest places of conversion to Jesus after his death is actually in Samaria. Much more receptive there than in other parts of Israel. And so early on, the Samaritans are coming to Jesus in that particular area. And that says something, I think, about the historical Jesus, in that Jesus always cared about breaking barriers to the Samaritans, to being a person who wanted to include the Samaritans in what he was doing. To a normal Jew, that would be almost unheard of. But the people in Samaria apparently did have that historical remembrance of Jesus and converted to the faith. And so the faith is very strong very early on in Samaria. There are different groups that are around at the time that are, some accept Jesus, some don't accept Jesus, some accept Jesus as a prophet but not as God. And the church is slowly organizing itself in a way so as to understand who Jesus is and what this is all about. And that's what the apostles are. That's what Peter is doing in the Holy Land and what Paul is doing in the Greek world. So very early on, the church is growing in various parts that has various growing pains. There was a group that believed that Jesus was a prophet, but that he was not the Messiah. And they thought that John the Baptist was actually greater than Jesus. And they didn't die out until about the 4th century. There is a famous work called The History of the Church by a bishop, written about the year 380, 360, called Eusebius' History of the Church. And it goes through the Council of Nicaea. And it's probably is rescued for us many of the older documents about this earlier period of the church that we never would have had except for them being gathered by Eusebius. So Samaria is important. Samaria is very early on part of the growth of the church. And I think that's always interesting to note when we talk about Jesus' effect on people who are outcasts. The second thing that people ask me about is the role of Mary in the Scriptures. Well, Mary's mentioned by name in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and is prominent, obviously, in the Matthew and Luke in the infancy narratives. She's present in Jesus' early life, the trip to the temple, etc. So Mary's important there, but people say, well, Mary's name isn't mentioned in the Gospel of John. Well, that's true, but she's called Mother in the Gospel of John. But she's only called Mother twice. And somehow we think that means that she was not important in Jesus' life. But if you look carefully at the Gospel of John, she's mentioned at the very beginning, at the wedding feast of Cana, and at the very end, at the foot of the cross. So Mary is the bookends of Jesus' life in the Gospel of John. John is approaching things differently in how he presents the truth of Jesus than the Synoptic Gospels did. So Mary's important in all. When I was in seminary, I did a paper on the history of the virgin birth in the first 200 years of the church. And Mary is prominent in all of the early church fathers. And all of those who spoke of Jesus also spoke of his mother. As a matter of fact, it is up about the time of the Council of Nicaea that she gets the title Mother of God. The Greeks use the word Theotokos. And so Mary is important in the Gospels and important in the early history of the church. And the virgin birth is important as to the nature of the incarnation, the nature of Jesus being both God and man. And so Mary is that important person in the Scriptures from any perspective. Now finally, what I'd like to talk about is we talked about how the church developed early on. We came to have a name for this. We called it the apostolic succession. By that we mean that all the churches were founded by apostles or disciples of apostles who were then, by that time, called bishops. Now, many people argue about the nature of how that happened, but by the year 250, the apostolic succession is solidified all over the Orthodox world, otherwise those who believe as we believe, both in the Roman world and the Greek world, those who accepted the Council of Nicaea, those who accepted the apostolic succession. Essentially what it means is that the bishop's office as episcopus, which means leader in some translations, is passed on from the apostles through the apostolic succession. And if you read the early history of the church, as far back as we can go, bishops are always created by other bishops who claim descent all the way back, depending upon their diocese, to a specific apostle. Now, can you prove that up with documents from the time? No. But that is the belief of the church. And we, to this day, believe as Catholics, as Greek Orthodox, in the apostolic succession. That is what the nature of how our church comes to be. It is not a congregational church, but is a church of bishops as leaders under the apostolic succession. It's interesting in the Scriptures, we really don't have a mention of the episcopacy until the later epistles, the non-Pauline epistles, talking about bishops being present. But also we have references in the non-biblical world to bishops very early in the church. There is one called Ignatius of Antioch, who wrote a series of letters as he's being taken from Antioch to Rome to be crucified during one of the great persecutions of the church. At first, these letters, at least at the time of the Reformation, were thought to be forgeries, but it was demonstrated, I think, to the satisfaction of most normal scholars that they are originals, and that as early as, I think, 180, some people would say 200, there's an established bishopric in Antioch of Syria, and that bishopric is where Ignatius comes from as a single bishop. There's also St. Clement of Rome, who identifies himself as Bishop of Rome, and is writing letters to these various communities. I say writing letters because that was the nature of what Paul was really about in all those epistles we have. For the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, we're dealing with specific problems in specific churches that are being addressed by those in a position of leadership. And so the epistles, as I said a couple of sessions ago, are unique in that they are dealing with the real nitty-gritty of life. And that continues on even outside of the Scriptures, where there's these very early references to bishops, and bishops giving advices to churches on how to handle certain types of problems. To this day, the Holy Father writes encyclicals. That's another word, I think, for epistles. They are a commentary on the nature of problems in the church. Now, there's others, too. If you've ever read the epistle to the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, it's much more a theological letter, more in the nature of a teaching. But for most of the Pauline letters, the letters of James, they are practical letters, dealing with practical problems in the church. If you ever get a chance, after you're done reading Paul's letters, read the rest of the letters of the New Testament. Hebrews is pretty hard going, but James is interesting, and I think is worthy of a read. So until we meet next time, and if you have any questions, I've given you my email, sta5150@aol.com, And as usual, I have tried to keep this to 10 minutes, and I'm a man of my word. I'm now at 10:03, and I am signing off.